I think for a lot of people right now, especially currently in the Bitcoin space, there is that recognition of the failure of fiat systems and even their vulnerabilities. As you pointed out, all of us have a different kind of origin story as to how we came up to Bitcoin. But I think if there's one thing we can all agree on is that if every one of us recognize that the fiat system doesn't work long term and that it's going to be eventually replaced with something much worse, or it's just going to have like a collapse of some sort. And we've got historical precedent, as you mentioned, Zimbabwe being one of many of these types of precedent that have happened in the past, where the money has totally collapsed and people's livelihoods and so on with it. I think because of the fact that we're still living in a fiat world, and even the education system trains you to think in fiat terms, right? If you go to business school or you study economics or finance or anything of that nature, what you're being trained in or to think is how to function or build financial product from a fiat perspective.
Exactly. Yes.
So everything comes to you, even in your financial modeling, you're accounting for inflation and all of these other things because you're assuming that inflation is a given constant. Not that actually, why do we need to have inflation in the first place? Why, despite the technological advancement that we've had so far in the world, prices keep going up instead of down, etc., etc. So I think that it's it'll take a bit of time to get, let's say, hyper-Bitcoinization on a global stage happening as a result of this, because you still have even the institutions like the BIS, Bank of International Settlements, the Federal Reserve, and so forth, and even the ECB, and how they not just control the monetary policy aspect of it, but because the institutions like the universities and down the line, they're still following the Keynesian model and still teaching that Keynesian model. So there are a lot of people that are being trained in the wrong thing, which is one of the things that, if you really think about it, blocks a lot of people from adopting Bitcoin, because really it's more of that mental block based on previous training and experience. So I think it'll start with an intolerant minority, which already we have, and that's going to grow. And from there, I think by the time the fiat system collapses, that's kind of when we are going to have more and more people deciding, the laggards, on that technological adoption cycle. That's when you'll probably have a lot more people coming. But because right now, the majority of the people in the world, particularly in the developed world, so-called, are yet to experience like a currency collapse or hyperinflation, it's still like an investment. It's not being viewed as, listen, this is an exit plan,
Yeah.
right? This is the thing that's going to take you out of the fiat system. So because it's viewed as an investment, it's a portfolio. I've got stocks, I've got ETFs, I've got Bitcoin. And most likely they will have it as a Bitcoin ETF, not the real thing in self-custody, or it's sitting on an exchange somewhere. So yeah, that's kind of how I don't know if I can call that a pessimistic view, but I would say it's a rationally optimistic one.
And realistic optimistic, I would call it. Yeah, definitely. Kudzai, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
How are you doing? I've been following you for, I don't know, for a pretty long, actually, we've been following each other for a pretty long time. I don't know how many years, but I've been always reading your stuff.
It's been years, both on Twitter and on Nostr as well.
Yeah, yeah. I'm actually right now on your Nostr page. And it's always interesting because you always, from time to time, you do post some, sort of words of wisdom or even spiritual citations. It's pretty cool, actually, what you do. And so I like your approach to a lot of topics, would it be, vaccination or Bitcoin, of course, the core of the whole thing, But Kudzai,
Thank you.
would you please, for me and for, because I mean, I've been following you, but I don't know much about you. I just know that you had an interview. I haven't had a chance to listen to it with Daniel Bitten from what do you call it? Daniel Prince.
Daniel Prince.
Yeah.
Yes.
So could you just maybe, I don't know, whatever you want to, tell us about your background, what's your story connected to Bitcoin, and yeah, what's your
Mhm.
ethos and your background?
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I will start it this way. I think my Bitcoin story can be summarized in three ways. There are three paths that I can say merged into one that brought me to Bitcoin. The first path was once upon a time, I lived in Zimbabwe during the hyperinflationary period that the country went through. So, um, I went, I saw how the currency collapsed, where you started off with the highest denomination note was like $1,000 note to where we got to a point where it was like 100 trillion within a space of about, you couldn't say, about 5 years. So within a 5 year period, you go from having $1,000 note as your highest denomination to $100 trillion note. So what that did is it conscientized me to the extent of which, or the speed through which currency collapse can happen. That it's not something that, sometimes we think of it, especially if you're living in a developed country. It's a very, very, very far-fetched concept that you may be reading about the Weimar Republic, Argentina, or even Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, and all these different places. But it's a whole different ball game when you get to live through it, when you see prices changing by the hour, and when one of the what I would say profitable business becomes selling money counting machines because of all the different
Yes.
notes that people would be carrying, and you're carrying sacks and sacks of money to just buy a few groceries. So
Oh my God.
that also kind of woke me up. And
Yeah.
this was happening at the backdrop of the '08 financial crisis. So whilst the financial crisis was terrible, it was nowhere compared to what Zimbabwe was going through, to the point that we were looking at the financial crisis like, oh, come on, this is child's play. People are freaking out over nothing because what was going on there was much, much worse. So that economic or those economic headwinds sort of then brought to my mind, okay, there has to be a better solution than just fiat money. If fiat money can just collapse like this in a day. Now, of course, at the time, the logical thing was to put your money in dollars or some other hard asset if you were able to buy like real estate and so forth as a way of preserving your capital. So that's like story number one. I'll segue to the next one where I started working with smallholder farmers, I think around about 2014 when we started a business in the crop insurance space. What we had discovered was we'd just come out of a drought round about that time frame, and there was another drought that was forecasted to hit the southern African region. So at that point in time, it became clear that a lot of people, a lot of farmers in particular, were not necessarily going to harvest anything, meaning your income is going to be affected. But then we then discovered that a lot of these farmers, because of their income levels, they could not access crop insurance. Without crop insurance, where basically you insure your crops against natural disasters like drought or floods, hail, that sort of thing. And in the event of that happening, you get a payout either that reimburses you for your production cost, or if it's a bigger policy, it reimburses you for your production costs as well as, the expected profits that you were thinking of getting or that you were projecting to getting from that farming business or that farming operation. So in the event of a natural disaster, naturally, it means if the crops are destroyed, then you are not going to be expecting any income to come through. So most of the farmers did not have this, not because they didn't want it, but because it was expensive. So our approach to the problem was, okay, it's a technological and business problem where all we have to do is figure out how to drive costs down. And if you drive costs down to a level where people can afford, then voila. you've solved the problem, and then you could kind of sell it to these like smaller farmers. Now it turns out we were thinking the best approach is to strip out a lot of the things that make crop insurance expensive, which we did. But then we then came face to face with the reality that at the end of the day, you're going to have to interface or touch point with the bank or some financial institution of some sort. Now, in order to do that, especially when you're building an app, you're being charged for every call, API call that you're making, every interaction that happens between your app and the bank.
Mhm.
And by the time you're done adding up all of these mini costs as, things scale up, you then discover that actually no, whilst yes, there was a legitimate problem maybe with the product, but your bigger cost is just the way the financial system is structured. And as you know, with the fiat system, because it's based on debt, it by definition excludes everyone else or a certain threshold of individuals if you are deemed to be too small to handle or too small to be significant because the system already has inbuilt cost.
Right. And
You're
we're talking about
by
billions of people. I mean, I think it's important to emphasize how many billions are affected by this, but okay. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's about
Exactly.
1.1 billion people globally.
Yeah, I think
That's
even,
the number
yeah,
of
is at least the official number. Yeah. Mhm.
officially, yes. According to the World Bank. We
Yeah.
have to be clear where the numbers
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
But it could be more. It
Yeah.
could be more than.
Yeah.
So essentially, my point is, when you're seeing that actually no, it's the system, and this is
Mhm.
like I said, 2014 when we started on this journey. Back then you didn't have Lightning Network or anything of that sort where you could do like micropayments and so forth.
Right.
So whilst we did recognize that Bitcoin potentially is a solution, it wasn't a practical enough solution given transaction speed, let's say, and the number of if you needed to do insurance payout on a mass scale and quickly and easily, it wasn't really at the time feasible to incorporate it. But we did recognize that from a base money perspective, this would be probably the best solution. So that's another thing that also kind of opened my eyes to the fact that, you know what, this is super duper important. And, this is a necessity more than a luxury. In addition to that, I think this is also around about the time that there was this push that was happening where financial inclusion became like the topic of the day. This is because remember 2015, that's when we had the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals
Oh
being made
yeah.
official.
Yes. The agenda. Yeah.
So so now you can imagine everyone is singing the same song. I think one of the SDGs, I'm forgetting which one,
Mhm.
touches on sustainable farming as well as sustainable farming and food security, as
Mhm.
well as on financial inclusion. So our business was like right in the middle of those two. And then you had interactions with different groups around this question, and everyone was kind of talking about these buzzwords. But it always came down to blockchain, not Bitcoin.
Right. Right.
Or if it didn't come down to that, it was more fintech type solutions. Like, I don't know if you heard about the Kenyan solution M-Pesa, where
Yeah.
it was like mobile money, mobile money. So
Definitely.
it never really addressed the foundation, which
Right.
I could then see that, you know what, actually, this is the problem. And the third thing that sort of brought me to this path, I was always a curious person. I've always financial services and all these things have just been the center of my universe. I've always had interest in it, but I just never could figure out
Mhm.
why, like if you look at the stock market, why it's structured the way it is, why it's so gated, and all of these other third parties that you need to interact with if you want to list your company for raising money and so on and so forth. Because at the time, we had even considered coming up with a credit backed insurance, like an
Really?
insurance linked security.
Uh-huh.
You're right.
Okay,
So
I don't know
essentially,
how
when
that exactly works, but can you just briefly, like, what is that? I'm sorry, I'm a little bit layman on this.
not a problem. So essentially, to kind of summarize it,
Yeah.
think of your normal insurance product, right?
Yeah.
where if it's, let's say, household insurance, you have an underwriter that is the one that actually, where you're paying your premiums, they're the ones that are sitting with the risk. In the event that something happens, they then do the payout. Now, obviously, when you're starting out, an underwriter is going to charge you nominally for access to that capital as a company, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a way of backstopping whatever risks that you're going to insure. So what we then decided, or what we were thinking of, was to come up with, let's say, instead of using an underwriter, you create a credit product where, let's say, any financial institution can lend you that
Mm-hmm.
money, which you then use to backstop your losses. And then they get a cut of the premiums as they're coming in.
Mm-hmm.
And then after the insured period exceeds, they get their capital back plus, the premium interest and so forth. So that's kind of how you would structure kind of an insurance-linked security. But again, when you're putting that together, we wanted to work with an alternative exchange, and the fees that we're talking to set that up and all of this. In my mind, I was just thinking we could simply do this with a smart contract or something that is Bitcoin related, where there's a pool and program all these other things. And you don't even need to be dealing with all of these people. And so all of those things then brought me or radicalized me to a point where I realized that fiat money doesn't work. And not just from a peer to peer sovereign individual perspective, but even in how we do business and how the whole financial services industry
Mm-hmm.
is built on that foundation of fiat money.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's essentially a brief summary of how I then, after I discovered the white paper, I think this should have been around 2012, 2013, read it. Didn't really make much sense of it the first time, but I understood one thing, that this is a plan for money that is not controlled by anyone, particularly the state. So I
Okay.
was definitely gung ho on that and
Mm-hmm.
on board with that. And then obviously at that time you didn't have a lot of resources, so I kept learning and learning and learning what I could without obviously an IT background. That's a little bit. I understood the economics and the financial aspect, but it took me a while to get on to really wrap my head around everything else. But eventually, after a couple of months, yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
was ready. So
No,
yeah, that's
yeah.
essentially my story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story. It's always fascinating to listen to all these individual stories. I mean, even if I want to tell you, I mean, sort of just a short version. I also went through all this blockchain and crypto and ICO phase, shitcoin phase. But it took me
Absolutely.
approximately a year or so until I had the aha moment. Like, oh my God, like the core, the seed, I think, was the absolute scarcity of Bitcoin with all the other properties, that we know of, that why the ethos of Bitcoin, why Bitcoin, because it's the one and only truly, decentralized, unconfiscatable, absolute scars. I mean, every monetary technological property we could have ever dreamed of. So, you talk about
Absolutely.
Zimbabwe again. I want to go back to this because it's so important. Because I think the average person here, we call this the island of the blessed people, in Europe, in Austria, sort of, they don't know what
Yeah,
inflation is really. They haven't felt it. They haven't felt the pain
absolutely.
point, and I think each one of us has a different pain point, different people, different countries, different, economical, existential situations. So you don't need to, I guess, right? I think we're pretty sure we don't need to tell people in Zimbabwe what inflation is, what is, real monetary devaluation, like when $100 trillion or whatever, 100 trillion Zimbabwe note.
Yeah,
I mean, it's crazy, but I think it's a learning, it's like learning process, and also the speed of adopting it, using it as whatever store of value, medium of exchange, unit of account eventually, and eventually, hopefully, in the hopefully near future, to hyper Bitcoinization with by orders of magnitude, exponentially increasing purchasing power. This is what we need to think of when we talk about money and not in, we are still thinking in fiat terms, right? But people, I think, cannot even fathom, cannot even imagine what the power, of Bitcoin is, right? In the pretty, I guess, in the near future, where whether it be 10 million, 100 million, or even infinite purchasing power. So do you have hope that this will accelerate, hopefully, this process, and we can, eventually, leave all this fiat system just behind us, make it obsolete without fighting the system?
That's an interesting question. My view, at least, I think for a lot of people right now, especially currently in the Bitcoin space, there is that recognition of the failure of fiat systems and even their vulnerabilities. As you pointed out, all of us have a different kind of origin story as to how we came up to Bitcoin. But I think if there's one thing we can all agree on is that if every one of us recognize that the fiat system doesn't work long term and that it's going to be eventually replaced with something much worse, or it's just going to have like a collapse of some sort. And we've got historical precedent, as you mentioned, Zimbabwe being one of many of these types of precedent that have happened in the past, where the money has totally collapsed and people's livelihoods and so on with it. I think because of the fact that we're still living in a fiat world, and even the education system trains you to think in fiat terms, right? If you go to business school or you study economics or finance or anything of that nature, what you're being trained in or to think is how to function or build financial product from a fiat perspective.
Exactly. Yes.
So everything comes to you, even in your financial modeling, you're accounting for inflation and all of these other things because you're assuming that inflation is a given constant. Not that actually, why do we need to have inflation in the first place? Why, despite the technological advancement that we've had so far in the world, prices keep going up instead of down, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's a very, it'll take a bit of time to get, let's say, hyper-Bitcoinization on a global stage happening as a result of this, because you still have even the institutions like the BIS, Bank of International Settlements, the Federal Reserve, and so forth, and even the ECB, and how they not just control the monetary policy aspect of it, but because the institutions like the universities and down the line, they're still following the Keynesian model and still teaching that Keynesian model. So there are a lot of people that are being trained in the wrong thing, which is one of the things that, if you really think about it, blocks a lot of people from adopting Bitcoin, because really it's more of that mental block based on previous training and experience. So I think it'll start with an intolerant minority, which already we have, and that's going to grow. And from there, I think by the time the fiat system collapses, that's kind of when we are going to have more and more people deciding, the laggards, on that technological adoption cycle. That's when you'll probably have a lot more people coming. But because right now, the majority of the people in the world, particularly in the developed world, so-called, are yet to experience like a currency collapse or hyperinflation, it's still like an investment. It's not being viewed as, listen, this is an exit plan,
Yeah.
right? This is the thing that's going to take you out of the fiat system. So because it's viewed as an investment, it's a portfolio. I've got stocks, I've got
Yeah.
ETFs, I've got Bitcoin. And most likely they will have it as a Bitcoin ETF, not the real thing in
Yeah.
self-custody, or it's
Exposure.
sitting on an exchange somewhere. So yeah, that's kind of how I don't know if I can call that a pessimistic view, but I would say
No,
it's
it's
a rationally optimistic one.
and realistic,
Where,
optimistic, I would call it. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
yeah,
And we both, I mean, let's just, I mean, I think I speak also for, but, my opinion is, this whole what do you call it? Fiat derivative system of rooted in Bitcoin with Saylor strategy, the corporate strategy, all these institutions coming in. They are fulfilling the role, whether we want it or not. Of course, we would. I think we would both want, or all the Bitcoiners would prefer that billions of people, simultaneously, come in and start saving and self custody. Would it be, even an incremental, like a few dollars, few euros, and but they're fulfilling the role. It's perverted, it's very inverted, but it's psychological help for people, because it of course it's exponentially catapults the price up, when not only a few trillions but then tens and then hundreds of trillions pour into Bitcoin, it will catapult. But the thing is, I mean, there are only 21 million Bitcoin, and it really doesn't matter when people, enter, into Bitcoin. I think it really doesn't matter, because eventually all these trillions and trillions and institutions coming in, all their whatever stretch and this and that, I mean, it's good for the market, but I hope they're going to become obsolete, because as Simon Dixon, because I've been following him too, he says, whatever you want to do, self-custody is the only, and really the only thing that you can do. Everything else is just a subordination to the, what do you call it, to the financial industrial complex, as he calls it, right? I mean, I don't know, what's your position on that? I mean, eventually, if Saylor's strategy, accumulates, I think they're literally doing it right now. Every week they are taking 30,000 Bitcoin every week. I mean, if they manage to, to accumulate 30 to 50,000 Bitcoin every week, I mean, they'll be, the biggest bag holders in the whole world. I'm just concerned, like, what does it do, to eventually to the, I'm talking about like humanity, like what does it do to the mass of people?
You see, I think let's start it like this. We knew that at some point there was going to be some type of institutional adoption that would come. Whether that institutional adoption was going to happen the correct way, quote unquote, or it was going to happen in a way that would be sinister. Obviously, that wasn't something that was considered. But let's put that aside. The fact is, we are here now. So the question is this going to be something that will long term be good or bad? Well, I look at it this way, to kind of bounce off of Simon's thesis. I agree with him 100% that self-custody at the individual level is definitely the way to go, because if without that, you don't really own Bitcoin. You own a security or a derivative, but you don't own Bitcoin if you don't have the keys, or if it's not in your possession. So that is definitely important.
Exactly.
And should the fiat system collapse, or should they reset the system and bring in, let's say, a CBDC-based system? Yes, you will still have your Bitcoin ETF, but you're not going to be protected from that when it does happen.
Yep.
So that's the risk with, let's say, going via a strategy by owning strategy stock, or by doing the whole BlackRock Bitcoin ETF thing. And if you need to then transact outside of the system, you can't do it because you're still tethered to the fiat system.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, I think institutions are going to do, given the leverage that the state has on them. Like, I do not foresee a scenario in which a strategy, given its size and given the fact that they've been using financial markets to raise debt to then buy Bitcoin, and all of those, what do you call it, bonds are still outstanding and so on. I don't see a point at which they are going to turn against that system and say, no, we're actually going to start, unless something drastic happens. But obviously, I don't foresee that happening. I foresee maybe they're going to do Bitcoin backed types. If you listen to Saylor, the way how he laid out some of these things in a whole lot of podcasts, I get the impression that he's trying to eventually become some sort of Bitcoin bank.
Yeah.
or Bitcoin lender at a
Yeah.
massive level,
Hmm.
mainly targeting like institutions or other big corporations of that nature.
Hmm.
Meaning that at the base of it, it might still be fiat loans, but where it's got some sort of Bitcoin backing. That's the major concern with a lot of the institutions, why it makes, self-custody even more imperative, that they are just going to look at, because they're already listed on these stock exchanges, they're operating under SEC oversight and rules and regulations. So to a certain degree, and BlackRock is also like one of their largest shareholders, as you know, they own a little piece of everything. So that leverage is still there. And it's very difficult to foresee how they're going to turn on that, at least in the short to medium term. Or Tesla is an example. Remember when Elon bought, what was it, 1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin? Then eventually he started singing a song about, oh, Bitcoin's environmental
Yeah.
ESG footprint is a problem and so forth. Then eventually sold, I don't know how many Bitcoin they still have, but obviously, I think at that point in time, as an individual, he can see the value. But when you're running a public company where you've got all of these players at the table, they've got leverage. So
Yeah.
it might be used to preserve the fiat system, which is why, as individuals, the self-custody then becomes very important in order to still transact freely peer to peer.
Yeah, and that's what Simon Dixon, I think, also always emphasizes or criticizes. Will it be
Mm,
Jack Mallers, Adam Back? I mean, once you do a
yeah.
deal with the fiat mafia, they got you, man. I mean, you can't just back out. And then, the people who have invested, I mean, they're going to be rock pulled eventually. I mean, seriously, I can even imagine the mid to long term in the name of national
Mhm.
security, what could happen, like confiscation of the Bitcoin that strategies accumulated, whether it be 1 or 2 million Bitcoin in total, or more or less, it doesn't matter, right? I don't know. With all the insanity, irrationality, and I mean, everything's going on. I find it not only realistic but plausible and yeah, in the mid or long term. But okay, that's why this is why it's so good that people like you, me, Simon Dix, or other people. And it's like, hey, self custody of fucking Bitcoin, right? But
Yeah.
that's the way it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I think at the end of the day, that's what I think is more important to realize the leverage aspect. That
Yeah.
once you're part of that system, even if let's say your intentions are in the right place, are you going to die on the hill of I want to protect self-custody for the masses, or you're going to try to protect the company that you started and the profit? So obviously, from a more pragmatic self-interest perspective, most people are going to choose a company first, and that's going to come with strings attached. However, those strings are going to be pulled or looked at, it remains to be seen. But definitely, the fiat mafia or the fiat cartel, as I like to call them, are definitely not just going to sit back and watch
Exactly. Yes.
fiat die without putting up a fight. Bank of International Settlement currently has been running different pilot programs to test different CBDC platforms, whether wholesale CBDCs or retail CBDCs, and you can see they're preparing for a future where the CBDC is the standard.
Yeah.
So that already tells me by definition, and a lot of the central banks are on board, meaning it's just going to trickle down from central bank levels to the banking systems themselves. And all they will just say is it can just start off with something as simple as we're not going to back any company or bank any company that's going to be, let's say, a Bitcoin exchange, as an example.
Yeah.
So it becomes financial censorship by exclusion, where
Hmm.
they'll say, oh, these businesses, kind of like Operation Choke Point,
Yeah.
these businesses that are engaged in these types of activities, because we have these directives that we've signed on to from the central bank, and which we know come from the BIS in that fashion, we can't do business with you. You don't even need like a law that says no Bitcoin or anything. They'll just do it like that, which will choke a lot of Bitcoin businesses and eventually trickle down to what you're saying, what we're discussing, the self custody aspect and so forth.
Yeah.
That's why I believe currently, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of not just securing the self-custody aspect, but even for Bitcoin businesses themselves to be less and less reliant
Hmm.
on the fiat banking system, because that's going to be a choke point, if
Exactly. Yes.
not now, but eventually.
Hmm. You know,
Yeah.
uh, I just wanted to say, I mean, before we wrap this up, I mean, in a few minutes, but maybe we could do like a longer format sometime in the near future. Could it's that you know, it becomes more and more important, you know, when you zoom out again and we listen to all
Mhm.
this, you know, to all the, you know, ethical people who say, hey, we got to go back to community, right? Community focused, local, regional. We need to see like not 10,000, maybe hundreds of thousands, millions of little spark of lights everywhere on this planet, like community,
Mhm.
like focus on the community. And then it's once it's, you know, planetarily wise, like decentralized in a literal sense, I think the old system just becomes obsolete. But I think it needs the adoption rate of at least 3 to 5% Earth's population for
Yeah.
this decentralized structure around this planet. And I think this with Bitcoin, I mean, what do they want to do? I mean, even if they come up with new laws, so what? You know, we're going to be like
Mm.
asterisks and obelix, you know, like little villages all over the globe. And seriously, I mean, realistically speaking, this is the only way that I can see. Now, I mean,
Mhm.
I want to talk to you about maybe next time, like, what do you see really the real dangers, threats, hurdles,
Mhm.
challenges to Bitcoin? I mean, I see it sort of, I see Bitcoin has a transition phase or a limited time an opportunity to really work this out by orders of magnitude faster because of the, you know, energy information communication structures, because
Mhm.
of the magnetic, you know, exponentially decreasing or diminishing magnetic field of the Earth. And what do you do when technology doesn't work anymore? I mean, in a literal sense, it's not quantum bullshit. You know, we have all the technological solutions. It's all going to come out, you know, eventually, sooner or later. It's like once, you know, the but you know, it just goes into a different rabbit hole right now. But is there anything like important we have not mentioned, or you maybe you wanted to mention or wanted, you know, to talk about?
I think, kind of as a setup, particularly for the next conversation, I think the most important aspect, perhaps currently, in my view, it's two things that need to be kind of priority. One being Bitcoin being used more as a medium of exchange. It doesn't, like I pointed out, it doesn't have to necessarily be kind of like what we had in El Salvador, where you have a country saying, okay, Bitcoin is legal tender. As much as that was great, you saw what happened. The IMF came in
Yeah.
and they then leveraged the whole thing. So it didn't necessarily diminish anyone's ability who is in El Salvador to receive or use Bitcoin as a currency, but at least the IMF, what they managed to do is to defang the whole process and to throw spanners into the works. So I don't see quote unquote nation state adoption like that as sustainable. But I think bottom up, where we are trading with each other, peer to peer, I think that's really where the magic happens, because now you then develop these trading communities and these trading networks across borders and even within the same country, where now the Bitcoin is circulating. It's not just, hodled somewhere in a Coinbase custody solution of some nature, but it's now circulating as money should. So I think that's like that's definitely priority one. Priority two would be on the privacy aspect,
Mhm.
because as we know, currently there are issues with on the base layer. You don't necessarily have it's pseudonymous, but it doesn't have, those
Mhm.
privacy guarantees inbuilt, meaning a lot of that might need to move to layer two
Mhm.
solutions or layer two, layer three, whichever layers you want to look at it from. If, for example, it's quote unquote too late to have some sort of privacy guarantees enforced, maybe that's the quickest solution. So I think privacy and using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, those are going to be important going forward, because those are the things that will secure, as the system collapses, the fiat system, and as the CBDCs are rolled out, and all of these other things, like you pointed out, they're also going to have the accompanying legislation, which we have seen in many countries, where they'll say, no, transacting in Bitcoin is not allowed, or even trading it. up
Right.
until the only way you can legally buy Bitcoin is through a BlackRock ETF or a strategy product of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the medium of exchange and privacy becomes super duper important. So, in a nutshell, I think those are where we need to have. Of course, there are others. Obviously, decentralizing mining is another one.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's definitely, I would say, for the next conversation.
Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah, wonderful, Summer. Thank you for sharing that. Kudzai, thank you so much. Where can people find you? Or I know you also write articles on Substack, or right?
Yes, so I'm mainly on Noster,
Mm-hmm.
and I do have like a Substack, which I
Mm-hmm.
will send the link over
Please.
so
Yeah.
people can find my work. So it's Noster and Substack. That's why I'm really active on primarily Noster. Substack is just a way for me not to preach to the choir.
Yeah.
So because there's still people who are still in the fiat world that I think need to hear some of the stuff I have to write and talk about. So I put it out there for them up until they're ready to make the transition to freedom technologies like Noster. I still have a Twitter account, but it's not that active.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll
Me
put it
neither.
out anyway.
Yeah. I try to stay in Master too. Yeah. I'm trying to
Yeah,
get away from this scrolling shit. So
absolutely.
yeah, more quality, and I'm trying to get this is really addiction shit. It's just really addictive.
Yeah.
My wife is constantly telling me, I should stop doing so. I try to delete
She's a
it and
wise
then I
woman.
reactivated it again, and so, so I don't know. So Kudzai, thank you so much. I just love not only your ethos but your content, and yeah, keep it up, and hopefully we can do maybe a longer format conversation in the very near future, maybe together with Daniel or the two of us. Or
No, I would appreciate that, and thank you so much. Thank you for the compliment, and I'll try to keep the content going.
oh, definitely we need you. Kudzai. Okay, Kudzai, thank you
Thank
so
you,
much,
brother.
and talk to you soon. All right,
Likewise. Bye bye.
bye bye, take care.